Hello everybody and welcome to today's video, which is going to be a little bit different because this isn't really a straight review. In this video we're going to be talking about a number of different things, of which this beautiful Alfa Romeo is one. As you might have guessed from the video's title, what I'm currently on the hunt for is a new daily driver. Now, I have a number of vehicles at my disposal, but up until recently, the vehicle that I called my daily was my 2007 BMW 130i. And indeed, there's many reasons I really like that car. In fact, it's the only car I've ever bought back after having sold it because I, well, pretty much instantly regret that decision. However, recently I've become aware of the fact that the 130 isn't really the ideal all-rounder on the driveway, and because of that, it just has to go. I don't have all that much space at home. I've got a couple of storage spots and that's it, but I do need every vehicle on the driveway to have a place. I have the Ferrari for nice long-distance cruising, having a bit of fun and just generally enjoying. The Lamborghini, of course, for the wild supercar theatrics and just having a blast for half an hour. The Celica is absolutely fantastic down a back road and a nice piece of 1990s rally heritage. My S2000 then, of course, is the perfect car to hop in when the sun is shining and you want to just enjoy a bit of a drive. However, none of those cars are really very good at carrying multiple people, so I need something which can then carry passengers and, when required, luggage too. The 1 Series is pretty poor in that regard, so it has to go. I've chosen this particular car to use for this discussion for a number of different reasons. Firstly, it's actually a car that I might consider as my next daily, but I don't think it'll quite make the cut. And by analysing this car, I'm going to be able to work out what it is that I love about this car, but also what makes it not quite suitable for my needs. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about Alfa Romeo as a brand, because let's face it, it's a pretty divisive one. I have today owned 3, an ill-fated GTV V6, a Brera, which was a lovely thing to look at, but just a bit of a pig to own and entirely impractical, even compared to the 1 Series, and a 147 Q2 Sport that actually was a really faithful companion for about a year of my life. I've subsequently driven a number of Alfa Romeos and found almost all of them to be characterful but somewhat flawed creatures. It's easy to be drawn in by them, and in fact, when Lorenzo dropped this car off this morning, I went back into the house and then came out and saw it sat there next to the Ferrari, and I thought, yeah, that's a cracking looking car. I have actually recently driven a 156 Sportswagon. I did so up in Scotland last year. That was a slightly different spec of car. It was in black, and I have to say red really does suit it. It's also got the only wheels I'll ever accept on an Alfa Romeo. There's also a couple of mods that make this stand out. It's got a Super Sprint exhaust, centre and back box. It's also got the full Roddy Harvey-Bailey springs and dampers on it, front and rear. Uprated 330mm discs, which is a popular upgrade, and a Q2 diff. A lot of people would buy one of these cars just for the engine. That fabled Busso lump is a wonderful thing, very characterful, and it's reasonably effective, not incredibly potent at about 250 horsepower, but it makes a nice tune. Lovely. And let's be honest here, for a lot of people, when it comes to something like an Alfa Romeo, it looks good, it sounds good, job done. But that's not quite the case for me. You see, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like I said, in many ways, this is the kind of car that I want. As a car YouTuber, I'd like even my boring daily driver to be something a little bit different, a little bit interesting, something I can talk about, make some content on, or at the very least, be a car that people will associate with me. I don't want to go and buy something that everybody else has. I want people to know that, oh yeah, JayEmm, he's the guy that's got one of these. And the Alfa would certainly fit the bill. In fact, there are just over 100 of these 156 Sportswagons made for the UK, so realistically, the attrition rate of these things means you're probably looking at less than 100 left now. This, being in the correct colour and having a sunroof as an option, means it's probably a pretty rare thing. Lorenzo has also picked very well, and he has a habit of doing that. Lorenzo has brought a number of cars to the channel, and in fact this week alone he's bringing me 2 of them. This and his Subaru Legacy, another car that I think could well be a contender for my next daily driver, but more on that of course in its own video. This really is a fabulous example of a 156. I've driven a number of 156s and 147s, and none of them have felt quite as tight as this. Gearbox in particular, nearly all the others I've driven, the gear shift has been a real weak point of the car. Here, I wouldn't say it's the best gearbox in the world, but it's actually really good. Like, this is a nice gearbox to use. This is how this gearbox, I think, should be. So what are the things that mean I'm having to get out of the 1 Series? Well, the biggest one is space. It's just not a big enough car for me, really, so I need something a little larger. I do love estates, and of course the 156 comes in Sportswagon guise, so that is a big plus point. It also has a sunroof, and I do like me a sunroof. It's also got 5 doors, and I've realised that 5 doors really is going to be something of a necessity. Now, I did, until very recently, have a nice large car with a reasonably sized boot and 4 doors in the form of my BMW 760 Li, now the property of the very lucky It's Joel. I did enjoy having that car when it worked, but that was very rarely. It was constantly giving me jip. I'm very glad to see that Joel, I think, has gotten to the bottom of some of the problems I had, and typically he hasn't spent anywhere near as much on fixing it as I did. But I'm very glad for Joel. The 7 Series, though, as nice as it was, is going to be a car that's always going to be very expensive to run, and the cost of these things in terms of running isn't as much of a worry now. But what is the amount of time I'd be without the car. I don't want it to be constantly worked on. So that puts pretty much any 7 Series out of the running, same for S-Class. They're also a very large car, and that's not entirely a deal breaker, because like I say, I do need something bigger than the 1 Series, but the boot space in them a little bit poor for the size of car. That is very common with big executive cars, because you've got lots of fuel and a fridge and all sorts of stuff in the back where your boot space would normally be. I suppose really something like an Audi RS6 would be quite a sensible purchase for me, but a little bit too expensive to get one that I'd actually want. I don't like the old V8s because, well, they're trouble, and the V10 again would ruin me. I've already got the one V10 on the driveway. I don't need another. I would quite like a V8. I think so. Fuel economy is not a worry for me. Fuel economy is not something that's really bugging me at all. So 25 to 30 to the gallon, that's fine. A sub 20, I think I probably have to say no to. For that reason, I think I'm highly unlikely to go and buy, say, a BMW M5 Touring, as much as I'd like one. But again, another V10 on the driveway and a V10 as a daily driver, no. There are times in the month often where I don't really have that much money, and having a car that costs that much to run I think would annoy me. In fact, in the M5, I think what would get on my nerves most is the range of the thing, because it doesn't have any bigger fuel tank than a normal 5 Series, yet it drinks like Oliver Reed on a particularly heavy bender. So you can never really go very far between fuel stations. That was actually a gripe of the 1 Series too. Not especially a thirsty car, did about 32 as an average, but only a 50-litre fuel tank meant that I was filling it up more frequently than I would have liked. I want to get at least sort of 300 or 400 miles between fuel ups, ideally. Fuel itself is actually also a real sort of thinking point, because on the one hand, a diesel would actually suit my needs quite well, good as a long-distance cruiser, torquey, easy to drive, all that jazz. But diesel's falling out of fashion fast. The roads I drive on don't really have tolls or restrictions or anything like that, but I just don't fancy the idea of a diesel. I wouldn't say no to a hybrid, but there aren't many hybrids that I want, and you usually seem to pay a premium, so petrol is likely the way I'm going to go. That's not to rule out diesel, just it's not my first choice. This car, before Lorenzo picked it up, had only the 2 previous owners, and you can tell very clearly it's really been cared for. In fact, one of those owners had it for 14 years. It's a 2003 car, and generally speaking, it's in excellent condition. Unfortunately, Alfa Romeos of this period are very mixed quality, so you get this kind of weird, this is not really plastic, I'm not sure what it is, feels like vinyl or something. Then you get nice bits of leather. These seats look great, although they are quite firm. You feel like you're perched up high. The dials down here look great, but then half of the screens in here aren't quite working properly. Dual zone climate control is very nice. And there is one other requirement I'm going to have of a car that I know is a bit of an oddity, but something that is important to me. I need a car that has the ability to get fitted Android Auto. We have recently changed the laws here in the United Kingdom regarding using mobile phones whilst driving, and although I am generally pretty good with not using my phone at the wheel of a car, there are some pretty oddball bits of the law. So even if you're pulled up on the side of the road, if the engine is running, technically you shouldn't be using your phone. And I have absolutely no interest in being done by a copper when I'm in the middle of filming and I pull onto the side of the road to read a text message or something like that. That would just be a really, really stupid way to get 6 points. So I do need something which can get me my nav, phone calls, all that sort of stuff on a nice, easy to use screen, which won't then get me nicked. So having Android Auto capability in a car, very important. That just means really that you need either a double DIN slot, which I'm pretty sure you can get double DIN fitted in here somehow, or you need a car which has already got it. Now, what's my budget going to be? Because that obviously is pretty critical. Well, you're talking between, say, £10,000–20,000. That's kind of where I'm looking at. I was looking at Kia Stingers and things like that, but really, for one I want, you'd be looking at about 25 to 30 grand, and that's just too much. I'm still paying out for the Lambo. I've got monthly payments going out on the Ferrari, all that kind of jazz. So getting another really expensive car at the minute, I don't think is a possibility. Something at sort of £10,000 to £15,000, I think is going to be fairly easily doable, and also it should get me the kind of car that I would like. Now, generally speaking, that's going to get me a car which obviously is a bit older, sort of, you know, 10 years old or so, and I can deal with that. That should be a car that's new enough that it's going to work and not be too unreliable, and I should also be able to plumb in Android Auto. This is another one of the reasons that the 1 Series has to go. Because mine has the iDrive system in it, you can replace the screen and everything, but you will lose a whole bunch of functionality at the time. Originality is not really a concern to me, but functionality is, and I don't want to lose anything or have, you know, dials and stuff that no longer work because I've had to upgrade the car. So that is a key consideration. I have also thought quite a bit about getting another Alfa Romeo. That's one of the big topics of today, Alfas. I do love the way they look. I love the way they sound. I love the passion that they have. Years ago, I would just go and buy a BMW, or I guess maybe, you know, I'd think about an Audi or a VW or something like that, because they're great all-rounders. They're very safe choices. You know, in so many, in fact, nearly all measurable ways, a BMW I could buy for the money I'd have to pay out to get one of these is going to be a better car. It's just as simple as that. There are many reasons this is not a great car. Allow me to demonstrate one of them. Turning circle. This is like a particularly woeful battleship when it comes to turning circles. But then it makes this noise. Brisk, not super fast. This 250 horsepower. It's not an especially lightweight car. The steering in the 156 is an oddity because it's a very fast rack. It's a 1.7 turns lock to lock. The regular ones are not exactly slow, but this is even quicker. You'd think that would mean it would be really, really darty and keen to turn off center, but it's just not. Allow me to demonstrate. Look at this. I can turn the wheel quite a bit, and it's obviously the car is moving. But, you know, in most cars, you'd expect to be sort of over there. You know, you'd be doing like, way, that sort of thing. It's just not. Little bit woo, little bit wee, little bit whoosh. Fast show reference there for 1990s kids. So, while we're stuck behind the lorry ruining all my fun, what other things does this car get absolutely right? Well, it's got the petrol head thing covered. Okay, it's a cool car, it's rare, it's unusual, not impossible to find pieces for. However, it's kind of an age now, isn't it? Let's be honest, it's just that little bit too old, I think. You're approaching 20 years for most of these. This is a 2003, so this is already an 18-year-old car, and although it's been well cared for, just looking at some of the history of it, 4 years ago, it had to have a new head gasket, had the head skimmed, all that sort of stuff, and that's a pretty big job for a car that has less than 90,000 miles on the clock. That's not actually work that's unheard of with these cars either. The front-wheel drive bit bugs me. It's always bugged me with these. In fact, I almost certainly would have owned one at one point had they been rear-wheel drive. For that reason, one of the cars I have often considered, have yet to drive, but do have a couple on offer, is the 159. Those are also front-wheel drive by default, but if you can find the incredibly rare 3.2-litre cars, those were available with the all-wheel drive system, the Q4, and that can send 70% of its power to the back. It's a decent system, actually, a Torsen one. And to me, that then gets a pass. That's okay, I can live with that. I know I shouldn't judge this car for being front-wheel drive, I should judge it by how it drives, yet it's just something that would always bug me. But steering in these is never quite as good as you think it should be in an Alfa either. There's a little bit of lightness, it's just got a bit of aloofness about it. It's a shame really, because ultimately an Italian car, flawed as they might be, should be about that driver involvement, the experience, and this has got it in so many ways. The engine, lovely, and it will get round a bend, but it just doesn't seem to involve you as much as I would like it to. The suspension upgrades to this car have given it quite an edge of firmness. It doesn't really go away as you pick up speed, and that, I think, would ruin it a touch for me. An enormous farm vehicle approaching me, taking up most of the road. This exhaust is really well judged, I have to say. Whatever I buy, I do want to have some excitement, and this is where it's going to be really, really tricky for me, because I don't want to fall into the pit that I know I'm going to be pushing myself into, of starting to look at something nice, sensible. You know, I'm going to start off looking at a 330D estate, and then by the end of it, I'll wind up buying an Aston Martin Vantage, because that's what we do, isn't it, as petrol heads? You start off looking at one thing, and then 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, actually, but for that money, I could have one of these. Then you go, hang on a minute, that wasn't at all the type of car you wanted to buy. The Alpina D3 Touring that I recently drove, absolutely loved. That would be an ideal daily, other than the fact it's silver. However, you don't really tend to find many of those at that kind of price, because not many of them have 200,000 miles on. So I tried to find some older Alpinas, but you then get into the sort of E46 based ones, and I've had E46 BMWs, I've had two of them. I don't really want to be going over the same ground again. With something like this, I wouldn't feel that way. The 159 will be somewhat close, because the 159 and the Brera are related, but I think it'll be a different enough car. My concern with the 159 would be that they're a fairly compact car internally. They don't actually have that much space in them. I always recall the boot on them being actually surprisingly stingy. I've got something of a secret lusting for a 4x4, but I'm just not sure that I could do it for several reasons. First off, at £20,000, whatever kind of 4x4 you buy is probably not going to be a great one. It's going to be a touch ropey, isn't it? A £20,000 Range Rover, would you take that chance? The Lexus LS600 that I drove, loved that, fabulous thing, probably more reliable than a 7 Series or a Merc or an Audi equivalent, but it's just another big executive car, takes up a lot of space on the driveway, boot space again a bit compromised like it always is with these things, and they're reasonably rare. But it would be a very good car, I'm sure. It's a real shame that Lexus have this absolute, just, I don't know, fascination, fetish perhaps, for CVTs. So many of their cars I'd really be interested in. The interiors are great, they're nicely put together, they're going to be reliable, all that jazz, but they put horrible gearboxes in them. Of course, I know you could then say, oh, well, James, go and get the LS 460, which has the regular V8 and an 8-speed, but I didn't want the long wheelbase one. I'd want the super luxury one. You see, this is how my mind works. I'm quite enjoying driving this Alfa, actually. It's a very nice thing. So I did consider an Alfa Giulia. Here's another little bit of my Alfa philosophy. And I even had an Alfa Giulia as a courtesy car from Meridian Modena when my 550 was in for service. And for 3 weeks, it was absolutely fine. The diesel engine in it, I think it was the 2.2 or whatever they do, was somewhat coarse, but actually a very effective unit, pulled nicely from low down. Gearbox worked really well. I enjoyed driving it. You know, even the regular cars have a little bit of the sort of edge and that keen turn in that the Quadrifoglio does. But I was driving back to Meridian and I filled it up of diesel so I could give it back to them with a full tank. And in the petrol station, filled up, got back in the car, turned it on. The thing lit up like a Christmas tree, warning lights left, right and centre. I thought, it's all right, I'll just ignore them for a little bit. I drove to get out of the forecourt and it turned out one of the warnings was for the brakes. Now, you get a brake warning in a car. It's not always a biggie. It just might mean the ABS is not working or something along those lines. No. No, the Giulia, you have to remember, is brake by wire. One of the weak points about that car, actually. And the brakes weren't really working at all. I mean, really, like, it was like I put all my force onto this brake pedal and it was slowing down incrementally. I nearly crashed the car. It went clean across the road and I nearly hit a post box with it because the thing just would not stop. You didn't even have a proper handbrake in it. So that was terrifying. That was absolutely terrifying. Turned the car off, turned it on. Half those warnings went away, but it came up with a bunch of different ones that didn't really affect the car, and they ultimately, eventually, went away when it went back to Meridian, of course. And that kind of puts me off. That's a shame, really, isn't it? Because let's face it, Alfa is plagued by this reputation for poor reliability. If there's one thing that they need to sort, it's that. They just need to get it done. And it would appear that with the Giulia, they still haven't managed it. This car's actually really nicely sized for these kind of roads. This is typical of the kind of road I drive on a lot when I'm just driving about the place and also when I'm testing vehicles. And this is absolutely right. Initially, I thought that you sat far too high in the car, but what you eventually realise is that the bonnet is just really, really low. I don't help myself at all, and I'll be the first to admit that, because, you know, I'll have this internal struggle of like, well, James, you should just get a nice, sensible diesel or something like that, and that'll be really cheap to buy. And then I go, oh, but they do a 5-litre V8. Oh, yes, let's get that. I'm terrible. I'm absolutely terrible. I'm sure my petrol-heady friends watching can relate. So the 156 Sportwagon does tick a lot of boxes. It's rare. It goes well enough. It sounds good. It's got that petrol head kind of Q factor about it. It's a cool car. I also love the idea of the sort of all-Italian lineup on the drive. Having the Ferrari, the Lambo, and an Italian daily, that would be cool. Yes, I have considered Maseratis, but my friends at AV Engineering have shown me a few examples of Maserati that have really quite put me off buying one of those. I'm just not so sure about it. And in fact, I've spoken to a few Maserati owners and their experience has been one of polar opposites. They're either brilliant cars or absolutely awful, and it doesn't seem like it's very easy to work out in advance which you're going to get. Little things make me laugh with these cars as well, like the fact that when you want to open the boot, you can do it from the key or from a button in here. There's no handle to get it, you just have to get your fingers dirty and get in there. And then when you close it, you need exactly the right amount of force. Not too much, not too little. I thought that was a quirk of the last one of these that I drove. No, turns out that's just, they all do that, sir. These are available with the 6-speed manual, as here, and that's the one to have, or an automated manual that Alfa Romeo called Cellar Speed. In fact, a very close relative of Ferrari's F1 system. Uses some of the same bits, in fact. Every car is going to be one of compromises, and the Alfa is no exception. I know people will always think of the Alfas as one of the more flawed cars, and they're right in some ways, but the benefit of that is that they tend to be much better in certain areas. These are not jack-of-all-trades cars. They never were. For me, a car has 3 opportunities for mistakes, as it were, things that would put me off before I decide that actually it's not a car I can buy. And here's the 3 for the 156 that kill it for me. First off, the ride. I know this is on aftermarket suspension, but even in standard, guys, they're not brilliant. It's too stiff. As a daily driver, I don't want to put up with that. Secondly, it probably will break. It's just gonna happen at some point, and when it does, probably gonna be just a little bit too unreliable, just not quite good enough for daily duties. Thirdly, these are not cheap cars. Really, to get a very good example of one of these, I'm looking at probably the sort of £15,000 or thereabouts, maybe a bit more. I do see examples come up from around £10,000. You get the saloon for that kind of money, but they're not always the best. And like I said, you might have to spend on them. And for that kind of cash, I'd want an environment a lot nicer than this. Sure, there are bits of it that I like, the seats and so on and so forth, but as a package, it's just not quite good enough. However, if you can live with those quirks and you are thinking about getting yourself a nice, decent, unusual daily driver, I would really give one of these some thought. Or, if you don't quite need something this big, either the 156 Saloon, or even better, the 147 GTA, because that's a slightly later car, so it is improved in a few different ways. But, there we have it. There's a first video from me looking at my next daily driver. What it's going to be, I don't know. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.